Chapter 1. Prologue. The shadowy corridors of the Blackspire Tower were suffocating, the air thick with the scent of incense and the faint tang of blood. I moved silently, my boots gliding over the obsidian floor as I ascended the spiral staircase. Each step reverberated softly, a rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. Summons from the High Court were never trivial. The stakes were always life or death. Tonight I intended for it to be the latter, for someone else. The chamber at the top was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a brazier filled with violet flames. Shadows danced on the walls, but the figure standing by the window was unnervingly still. His robes, stitched with runes that pulsed faintly, gave away his station, a sorcerer of considerable power. A faint smirk touched my lips. They were always predictable, always scheming. Maltheris, the figure purred without turning, his voice like silk laced with poison. You are punctual. Good. I stepped into the room but said nothing. Silence was a weapon, and I had honed it as keenly as my blades. I have a task for you, the sorcerer continued, finally facing me. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could see the glint of his sharp eyes. One that will test even your talents. Speak plainly, I said, my voice low. I am not a lackey to be toyed with. A chuckle escaped him. Indeed. That is why you were chosen. There is an artifact, a chaos-bound amulet, held deep within the labyrinthine fortress of a warband in the northern wastes. Retrieve it, and you will find yourself elevated beyond your wildest dreams. Fail. His voice trailed off, but the unspoken threat was clear. What makes this amulet worth risking my life? I asked. My fingers itched to wrap around the hilt of a dagger, but I restrained myself. Answers first. Bloodshed later. Bloodshedding, said Ramon. It is a conduit of unimaginable power, capable of twisting fate itself, the sorcerer said, his voice tinged with greed. But in the wrong hands it could undo even the Drukai. We must claim it, before another does. And why not send one of your spell slingers? I countered. Why an assassin? Because, he replied, stepping closer, his gaze piercing. The fortress is not merely a place of stone and steel. It is a labyrinth of chaos. Sorcery bends within its walls. Only someone of your unique skill set can navigate it. I considered his words, the weight of the task settling in my mind. And the reward? The ear of the court, perhaps even the Witch King himself. His smile was razor-sharp. Such opportunities do not come lightly. Promises were as good as gold. I inclined my head, but my mind was already racing. Promises in Naggarond were as treacherous as the sea, but if there was even a shred of truth in his offer, the risk was worth it. I will retrieve your amulet, I said finally. But understand this, if your information is flawed, I will return, and I will end you. The sorcerer's smile widened. Then I shall pray for your success, Maltheris. The path to glory awaits. Chapter 2. The Assassin's Pact. The sorcerer's words echoed in my mind as I left the tower and descended into the city below. Naggarond, the city of chill, stretched endlessly before me, a labyrinth of jagged towers and treacherous alleys. Its beauty was cold and cruel, much like its inhabitants. Here, power was the only currency that mattered, and I intended to claim my share. As I slipped through the darkened streets, I replayed the details of the mission. A chaos-bound amulet, hidden within a labyrinthine fortress. A warband of savage marauders and demonic guardians. The odds were grim, but the promise of power was intoxicating. I reached the shadowed alcove of my sanctum and lit a single candle. Its weak flame cast flickering light on my weapons arrayed before me. Twin daggers, their edges gleaming with venomous enchantments. A short bow with arrows tipped in shadow steel. Tools of my trade, each one an extension of my will. The sorcerer had been careful to withhold specifics about the artifact, which unsettled me. Chaos artifacts were unpredictable at best, catastrophic at worst, but it didn't matter. This was my chance to ascend from the shadows to the heights of power within the Druchii hierarchy. I knew what they said about me in the court. Whispers of a low-born assassin clawing his way to relevance. But this mission would silence them all. Success would carve my name into the halls of Naggarond's history. The northern wastes were a nightmare of ice and madness, a land where the very air was laced with corruption. Yet I felt no fear. Fear was a luxury, and I had discarded it long ago. In its place was resolve, sharp and unyielding. As I strapped on my weapons and donned my dark cloak, I allowed myself a fleeting moment of satisfaction. The labyrinth awaited, and within its depths lay my destiny. Or my doom. Either way, I intended to leave my mark. The candle sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. It was fitting. I thrived in shadows, and soon they would know my name. Maltheris. Chapter 2. The Summons. The cold winds of Naggarond whispered through the stone halls of the fortress as Maltheris stood motionless, his back pressed against a pillar of jagged obsidian. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by flickering braziers that barely kept the oppressive darkness at bay. It wasn't often that the highborn of the Druchii court summoned an assassin like him in person. Such dealings were usually cloaked in layers of intermediaries and covert exchanges. Yet tonight, he had been ordered to appear alone, in the dead of night. He frowned, studying the painting. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his dagger, hidden beneath his long cloak. The summoner's identity remained unknown, but whoever dared call upon Maltheris in such a direct manner surely had a reason, one worth the risk of bringing him here. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, their face obscured by a porcelain mask, etched with runes that glowed faintly in the gloom. The robes they wore shimmered like oil on water, betraying their status as a practitioner of sorcery. Maltheris's lip curled in disdain. Sorcerers were always playing games, speaking in riddles, and meddling in powers they only half understood. "Maltheris," the figure hissed, their voice a silken blade. "You've been chosen." "Chosen implies I had a choice," Maltheris replied, his voice low and cold. "Speak plainly. Why am I here?" The sorcerer stepped closer, the faint scent of charred incense trailing behind them. "The Black Council has need of your particular talents. There is an artifact of immense power, a chaos-forged amulet, hidden deep within the labyrinthine fortress of a warband far to the north. This object has caught the eye of the supreme sorceress herself." Maltheris suppressed a sneer. Such lofty claims were often a guise for personal ambitions. "And what makes this bauble worth my time? Chaos trinkets are as dangerous as they are plentiful. This is no mere trinket," the sorceress snapped, their patience thinning. "The amulet holds the power to disrupt even the winds of magic. With it, our kind could nullify the spells of our enemies, break their wards, and twist their magic into weapons of our own. But more importantly," their voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper, "with it, you could secure your place among the lords of Naggarond, no longer an assassin skulking in the shadows, but a power in your own right." The words hung in the air, tempting as poisoned honey. Maltheris's gaze flickered, but his expression remained a mask of cold indifference. Where is this fortress? Maltheris continued, endeavoring to get truth. Where are you going? Caleb regenerated. In the wastes, beyond the borders of even the most fanatical of chaos marauders. It is a labyrinth, both physical and arcane, guarded by warbands and twisted beasts loyal to the dark gods. None who have ventured there have returned. The sorcerer's eyes gleamed through the mask. But I believe you will. A thin smile spread across Maltheris's lips. The flattery was transparent, but the promise of power was undeniable. Still, he was no fool. What makes you so certain of my success? The sorcerer raised their hands, conjuring an illusory map that hovered between them. The image shifted and twisted, showing a swirling fortress that looked more like a living entity than a structure. You are the best the Drukei courts have to offer. If you fail, it will not matter, for your failure will be your death. But if you succeed... Their voice trailed off, leaving the possibilities unsaid. Maltheris studied the map. Paths coiled and uncoiled, walls moved, and sigils of chaos flickered like dying embers. The fortress was a trap, designed to consume even the most cunning of intruders. A challenge worthy of his skills. "What's your payment?" he asked, his tone icy. "I don't risk my life for vague promises." The sorcerer reached into their robes and retrieved a black crystal, its surface shimmering with unholy light. "This shard is but a fraction of what you will earn. Succeed, and treasures beyond your imagining will be yours. Fail, and your name will be forgotten." Maltheris stepped forward, taking the crystal. Its cold pulse sent a shiver through his gloved hand. "I will retrieve your amulet, but when I return, ensure your promises hold true, or I will find you." The sorcerer inclined their head, unbothered by the threat. "Then we have an accord. May Cain guide your blades." Without another word, Maltheris turned and melted into the shadows. The labyrinth awaited, and with it the first step toward power. Chapter 3. The journey begins. The northern waste stretched before me like a living nightmare. Endless expanses of ice and jagged stone, fractured by rivers of blackened water that hissed and steamed against the biting cold. The sky above was a swirling mass of gray and violet, as if the chaos gods themselves were watching, eager to see my failure. But I would not give them the satisfaction. I adjusted the straps of my pack and tightened my cloak against the cutting wind. It was a futile effort. The cold seeped through everything, gnawing at my bones with an insidious persistence. No fire burned here, no warmth endured. The land itself was cursed, and I had no doubt it was eager to devour me. My path was uncertain, marked only by the crude directions etched into my memory. The sorcerer's instructions had been maddeningly vague. Follow the signs of chaos, and you shall find the labyrinth. Signs of chaos? In this blighted wasteland, chaos was everywhere. Every twisted tree, every unnatural shadow screamed its presence. The only certainty was that I would face death at every turn. Hours stretched into days, or so it seemed. Time was an illusion here, distorted by the unnatural haze. Each step brought new challenges. Blizzards descended without warning, their icy claws stripping the flesh from exposed skin. The ground beneath me shifted treacherously, as if mocking my every move. And then there were the marauders. I spotted the first patrol from a ridge overlooking a frozen valley, a dozen figures clad in mismatched armor, their weapons crude but lethal. They moved with brutal efficiency, their voices carried by the wind as guttural growls and manic laughter. These were not warriors bound by loyalty or honor. They were predators, and I was the prey. Dropping into a crouch, I melded into the shadows of a fractured boulder, my cloak blending seamlessly with the frost-covered stone. They would not see me, they would not hear me, and they would not live if they did. The marauders passed below, their leader barking orders in a tongue I did not recognize. My hand rested on the hilt of my dagger, but I held my ground. Drawing their attention now would be a death sentence. I was an assassin, not a fool. Human attackers could be trained a thing or two. As they disappeared into the mist, I exhaled slowly. The wastes were teeming with such groups, each more bloodthirsty than the last. They served the dark gods, willingly or otherwise, and their lives meant nothing to me unless they threatened mine. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were a prelude to something worse. I pressed on, keeping to the ridges and shadows, moving with the practiced grace of a predator. The land continued to shift around me, growing more hostile with every mile. The wind carried whispers now, voices that gnawed at my sanity. They spoke of failure, of betrayal, of my inevitable end. I silenced them with sheer willpower, refusing to succumb to the madness. It was on the third night, or perhaps the fourth, that I found the first true sign. A twisted monolith jutted from the ground, its surface covered in pulsating runes that writhed like living things. The air around it was heavy, suffused with an unnatural energy that made my skin crawl. This was no mere relic, it was a marker, a beacon of chaos leading me to the labyrinth. But I was not alone. A low growl echoed from the shadows, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against ice. My hand darted to my blade, and I turned to face the threat. Out of the darkness emerged a hulking beast, its form twisted and grotesque. A chaos hound, its eyes glowing with malevolent light, its fangs glistening with frozen blood. It lunged. I sidestepped, my dagger flashing in the dim light. The blade found its mark slicing through the creature's neck with a sickening ease. Black ichor sprayed across the snow, steaming as it hit the ground. The beast collapsed, its body twitching in death throes. I wiped my blade clean and surveyed the area. The hound had been alone, but I knew better than to relax. Where there was one, there would be more. This was their domain, and I was the intruder. The monolith loomed ahead, its presence oppressive, yet strangely compelling. I approached cautiously, my senses on high alert. At its base, I found crude carvings, symbols that matched the ones the sorcerer had shown me. They pointed the way forward, deeper into the heart of the wastes, toward the labyrinth and the prize it concealed. I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. The path was treacherous, the odds stacked against me, but I was closer now than I had been before. The wastes would not claim me, nor would the servants of chaos. I was Maltheris, and this land would remember my name. With a final glance at the twisted monolith, I pressed on, the shadows closing in around me. Chapter 4. Signs of the Labyrinth. Sign of the Labyrinth. The wasteland shifted beneath my boots as if it were alive, a living, writhing thing that sought to ensnare me in its madness. My every step was a battle against the land itself, and yet I pressed on. The sorcerer's vague promises haunted me, but so did the tantalizing thought of what awaited me if I succeeded. Power, freedom, a place among the elite of Naggarond. Such thoughts were enough to fuel my steps even as the wind howled at my resolve. It began with the statues. Twisted effigies rose from the frost-rimmed ground, each more grotesque than the last. They were crude at first, piles of bones lashed together with rusted chains, their skulls leering mockingly. But as I ventured further, the craftsmanship grew disturbingly intricate. Stone figures, carved with unnerving precision, stood frozen in poses of agony and worship. Each face bore the unmistakable mark of chaos, twisted features, mouths stretched in eternal screams, and eyes that seemed to follow my every move. I crouched near one of the statues, studying its surface. The stone was unnaturally smooth, yet veins of crimson pulsed faintly beneath its surface. Runes, jagged and sharp, spiraled across its form, whispering words I dared not repeat. I traced a finger over one of the symbols, and the air around me grew colder, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I pulled my hand back, feeling as though I had touched something alive. The labyrinth was close. It had to be. I continued forward, weaving between the towering effigies and jagged rock formations that littered the landscape. The further I went, the more distorted the world became. The sky churned with unnatural colors, streaks of violet and green crackling like lightning across the horizon. The ground beneath me shifted, sometimes swelling as if to swallow me whole. Then I saw the obelisks. They were unlike the monolith I had encountered before. These were larger, their surfaces covered in a thick, oily substance that shimmered unnaturally. They stood in a rough circle, their points angled inward as though converging on some unseen force. At the center of the circle lay a massive pit, its depths obscured by swirling black mist. The pit radiated malice, a palpable hatred that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows cast by the obelisks. My every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself forward. This was what I had come for. Signs of the labyrinth, proof that I was on the right path. The sorcerer had been maddeningly vague about its entrance, but I trusted my instincts. Chaos always left its mark, and these were no mere decorations. Carved into the base of the nearest obelisk were more runes, their jagged shapes pulsating faintly. I knelt to examine them, careful not to touch the slick surface. The symbols were similar to the ones I had seen before, but these were more detailed, more insidious. They told a story, though one fragmented and maddening. A tale of power and ruin, of those who had entered the labyrinth and never returned. Living. And then there were the warnings. Scrawled hastily into the dirt at the edge of the pit were words in a language I could barely decipher, a mix of low Gothic and the harsh dialects of the northern wastes. They spoke of madness and death, of the labyrinth's ever-shifting corridors that devoured the minds of those foolish enough to enter. One phrase repeated often enough for me to take notice. "The beast awaits." I stood, my gaze drifting toward the pit. Was this it? The entrance to the labyrinth? The air around it shimmered, distorted, as though reality itself recoiled from its presence. I felt it then, a low rumble, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. It was alive, or something within it was. My hand drifted to the hilt of my dagger as I scanned my surroundings. The air was heavy with the scent of iron and decay, and the faintest of noises reached my ears, a scraping sound, like claws against stone. My eyes narrowed. I wasn't alone. Shadows shifted near one of the obelisks, and I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure emerged, hunched and grotesque, its body a patchwork of flesh and metal. It wielded a rusted blade, its edges jagged and dripping with black ichor. One of the warband's sentries, no doubt, patrolling the outskirts of the labyrinth. It hadn't seen me yet. I moved swiftly, my steps silent as death itself. In moments, I was behind it, my dagger flashing in the dim light. The blade sank into the creature's neck, severing its spinal cord with practiced precision. It collapsed without a sound, its lifeblood pooling on the frozen ground. Wiping my blade clean, I glanced toward the pit once more. The signs were clear, the warnings undeniable. The labyrinth awaited, its secrets and dangers hidden within its cursed depths. I straightened, steeling myself for what was to come. The labyrinth was no ordinary fortress. It was a living thing, a maze of chaos that would test my every skill and shred my sanity if I allowed it. But I had no choice. The path to power was never easy, and I had come too far to falter now. Now Red King's people searched for me in the school and the marketplace. I straightened, trying to see how close I'd been. With one last glance at the sky, I stepped toward the pit, the shadows closing around me like a shroud. Chapter 5. Allies and Ambushes. The wastes never slept, and neither did I. I had barely put the obelisks and their ominous pit behind me when I sensed the shift in the air. A familiar tension crept along my skin, the unmistakable weight of being watched. It wasn't the labyrinth now, it was something else, something far more mundane but no less dangerous. Predators. The wind carried faint voices, guttural and sharp, cutting through the constant howl of the wasteland. I crouched low, my hands instinctively brushing against the hilts of my daggers. Following the sound, I crept along the frozen ridges, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The cold bit into my fingers, but pain was an old companion, and one easily ignored. It didn't take long to spot them. The rival warband was encamped near the shattered remains of an ancient cairn, their fire sputtering weakly against the bitter cold. There were 8 of them, men and women twisted by chaos, their bodies marked with crude tattoos and scars. Their armor was mismatched, scavenged from countless raids, but their weapons were deadly enough. Axes, flails, and cruel-looking blades rested within arm's reach. I observed from the shadows, assessing their movements. Their leader was easy to spot, a broad-shouldered brute wearing a horned helm, his right arm a grotesque mutation of sinew and claws. He sat apart from the others, sharpening his blade with methodical strokes. The rest were more scattered, their vigilance dulled by fatigue and arrogance. This warband was after the same prize. I had no doubt of that. Chaos artifacts drew predators like blood in the water. They might not have known exactly what they were hunting, but they didn't need to. The lure of power was enough. Chaos! They wouldn't leave this place alive. I weighed my options carefully. A direct assault was out of the question. Even a Drugii assassin wasn't foolish enough to take on 8 Chaos warriors alone. But chaos breeds chaos, and I knew how to use that to my advantage. I circled the camp silently, noting the terrain. The cairn itself was jagged and unstable, its stones slick with frost. The surrounding ground was uneven, scattered with debris and patches of ice. Perfect. I pulled a small vial from my pouch, its contents a volatile concoction of shadow magic and poison. It wasn't much, but it would serve its purpose. The first step was simple: sow confusion. I hurled the vial toward the fire, ducking back into the shadows as it shattered against the flames. A hiss filled the air as the fire erupted into a burst of black smoke, choking and acrid. The warband erupted into chaos, coughing and shouting as they scrambled to find the source. They struck in the confusion. The nearest warrior, a wiry man with a scarred face, barely had time to react before my dagger found his throat. He crumpled silently, his blood pooling on the frozen ground. I moved to the next, a hulking woman, whose back was turned as she tried to clear the smoke. A quick slash of my blade and she fell to her knees, gurgling. By the time they realized what was happening, I was already gone, melting back into the shadows. The smoke was beginning to clear, but their confusion lingered. They barked accusations at each other, their frayed tempers snapping. One of them, a younger warrior with a crazed look in his eyes, lunged at another, accusing him of betrayal. The camp dissolved into infighting. Their leader, the brute with the horned helm, roared for order. He slammed his mutated fist into one of the brawlers, sending the unfortunate warriors sprawling. "Enough!" he bellowed, his voice a deep rumble. "This is no time for weakness. Whoever did this is still out there." Clever. Too clever for my liking. The leader's eyes scanned the camp, sharp and calculating. He gestured to two of his warriors, sending them to search the perimeter. I stayed perfectly still, my body pressed against the ice-coated stones of the cairn. The searchers moved cautiously, their weapons at the ready. They were close, too close. One of them, a woman with a cruel smile and a spiked mace, passed within an arm's length of my hiding spot. I let her pass, waiting until her back was fully turned. Then I struck, my dagger plunging into the base of her skull. She collapsed without a sound. The other turned at the faint noise, his eyes wide. He barely had time to raise his axe before an arrow thudded into his chest, piercing through the weak points in his armor. I turned sharply, my bow still raised, scanning for movement. The leader was shouting now, ordering the survivors to regroup. It was time to end this. I emerged from the shadows, a wraith of death descending on their battered ranks. The leader met me head-on, his mutated arm swinging in a wide arc. I ducked beneath the blow, my blades flashing as I carved into his exposed side. He roared in pain but didn't fall, his strength fueled by sheer rage. I nodded. We circled each other, the air between us crackling with tension. He charged again, and this time I let him. At the last moment I sidestepped, sending him crashing into the unstable cairn. The stones gave way with a deafening rumble, burying him beneath a cascade of rubble. The remaining warriors faltered, their morale shattered. They turned and fled into the wastes, leaving their leader to his fate. I watched them go, my breath misting in the cold air. The camp was silent now, save for the faint crackle of the dying fire. I moved through the wreckage, collecting anything of value. A map, hastily scrawled and barely legible, caught my eye. It marked the location of the Labyrinth, or, at least, what they believed was its entrance. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I stood amidst the carnage, the taste of victory bitter in my mouth. These warriors were fools, but they were a warning of what lay ahead. Chaos had no shortage of predators, and I would need every ounce of my cunning to outlast them. The labyrinth awaited, and I would meet it alone. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Labyrinth. The path to the fortress was a descent into madness. The terrain shifted as I approached, becoming more fractured and alien with every step. The ground was no longer solid, but a jagged expanse of broken stone and blackened soil that oozed an oily sludge. The sky above churned with unnatural hues, a storm of violet and green lightning illuminating the warped landscape. It was as if the land itself recoiled at the fortress's presence, yet was bound to its corruptive will. And there it was, rising from the horizon like a dark god's nightmare. The labyrinthine fortress was not built, it was birthed. Its walls twisted impossibly, a shifting amalgamation of stone and metal, perpetually in motion. Towers spiraled into the sky, their surfaces crawling with veins of molten silver that pulsed like living arteries. The gate was a yawning maw of jagged teeth, its edges glowing faintly with an unholy light. Chaos sorcery emanated from the structure, saturating the air with its oppressive presence. It pulled at my senses, whispering promises of power and despair. My instinct screamed to turn back, but I had long since silenced such weaknesses. I was Maltheris, and I would see this through, even if it meant walking into the jaws of hell itself. I approached the gate slowly, keeping to the shadows cast by the fortress's unnatural light. The air around the entrance was alive, swirling with tendrils of dark energy that lashed out sporadically, like predators testing for prey. Each tendril carried a sense of malevolent awareness, as if the fortress itself was watching, waiting. Steeling myself, I activated the rune of concealment etched into the back of my gauntlet. The sigil flared briefly before fading, its magic wrapping me in a shroud of shadows. It wouldn't make me invisible, but it would render me little more than a faint outline, a trick of the eye. It had saved my life more times than I could count, and I trusted it now as I stepped closer. The gates loomed ahead, their surface writhing like molten metal. They pulsed in time with the fortress's dark energy, as though they were alive. I crouched near a jagged outcrop, scanning for sentries or traps. Chaos was unpredictable, but its followers were often creatures of routine. If there were guards, they would reveal themselves soon enough. A low growl echoed from the shadows, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. I tensed, my hand drifting to the hilt of my dagger. Emerging from the darkness were two figures, hulking brutes clad in patchwork armor. Their faces were obscured by crude helms, but their movements betrayed a savage cunning. These were no mere marauders. They were champions, handpicked by chaos itself to guard the labyrinth. They stopped just short of the gates, their gazes scanning the wasteland. I held my breath, willing the rune's magic to hold. One of them sniffed the air, his grotesque snout twitching. His gaze lingered in my direction for a moment too long, and I tightened my grip on my blade. If he saw through my concealment, there would be no room for subtlety. After a tense moment, he turned away, muttering something in a guttural tongue. The two resumed their patrol, disappearing into the shadows. I exhaled slowly, the tension draining from my body. Chaos champions were formidable foes, but they were not infallible. I would remember their patterns for when the time came to slip past them. With the patrol gone, I approached the gates, keeping low and silent. Up close, the fortress's aura was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with promises and threats in equal measure. They spoke of glory, of betrayal, of my inevitable doom. I ignored them all. The gates themselves bore no visible lock or mechanism, yet they pulsed with an undeniable intelligence. They would not simply open for me, nor would brute force suffice. Chaos demanded a price, and I suspected these gates were no exception. Drawing a small blade, I nicked my palm, allowing a few drops of blood to fall onto the writhing surface. The reaction was immediate. The gates shuddered, their edges glowing brighter as the tendrils of energy around them lashed out violently. I stepped back, my dagger at the ready, as the gates began to part with an agonizing screech. Beyond the threshold lay only darkness, a void so complete it seemed to devour the light around it. The fortress's interior was a mystery, but I knew enough of chaos to understand that it would not be static. The labyrinth would shift, its walls twisting and turning to confound and ensnare intruders. Still, I could not hesitate. With a final glance at the desolate wasteland behind me, I stepped through the gates and into the abyss. The air inside was thick, cloying with the stench of decay and corruption. The walls pulsed faintly, their surfaces etched with runes that glowed dimly, casting eerie shadows. The floor was uneven, shifting subtly beneath my feet, as if alive. Every sound, every drip of moisture, every faint rustle echoed unnaturally, amplified to deafening levels. I moved cautiously, my senses on high alert. The labyrinth was not merely a physical structure. It was alive, its very essence steeped in chaos. Every step I took felt as though the walls were watching, waiting to ensnare me. This was no ordinary mission. This was a test, a game played by the dark gods themselves. But I would play their game, and I would win, for failure was not an option. Not for me. With daggers in hand and shadows at my back, I pressed deeper into the labyrinth, ready to face whatever horrors it held. Chapter 7. Entering the Maze. The labyrinth closed around me like the jaws of some monstrous beast, its walls shifting subtly as if alive. The shadows here were not mere absences of light. They seemed to pulse and writhe, concealing whispers that clawed at the edges of my sanity. Every step I took echoed unnaturally, the sound spiraling away as if the walls themselves drank it in. This was no fortress built by mortal hands. It was chaos made manifest, a living, breathing maze designed to devour those foolish enough to enter. The first obstacle presented itself almost immediately. The corridor ahead widened into a chamber lit by a flickering crimson glow. At the center of the room stood a towering figure, its grotesque form silhouetted against the unnatural light. A demon sentinel. Its hulking body was a fusion of flesh and metal, covered in jagged plates of armor that seemed to pulse with unholy energy. Its head was adorned with curling horns, and its hands ended in wicked claws that twitched with barely restrained violence. The creature stood motionless, its burning eyes scanning the chamber with relentless precision. It was a predator, and I was its prey. I pressed myself against the wall, cloaked in the shadows that clung to the corridor's edge. The rune of concealment still shimmered faintly on my gauntlet, but I knew better than to trust it entirely. Demons were not bound by mortal senses. They could see what others could not, feel what others could not. If it sensed even a whisper of my presence, I would be dead before I could draw my blade. Patience was my weapon now. The sentinel began to move, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Each step sent faint tremors through the ground, rattling the warped metal beneath my boots. It stalked toward the far end of the chamber, its gaze fixed ahead. For a moment, its back was turned, exposing a path to the opposite corridor. I moved. Years of training honed my body into a weapon, and I slipped across the chamber with the silence of a shadow. My boots touched the ground only briefly, my movements fluid and precise. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced it to quiet, focusing solely on the path ahead. The sentinel shifted suddenly, its massive head turning slightly to the side. I froze mid-step, pressing myself against a nearby pillar. Its burning gaze swept the room, lingering dangerously close to my position. For a moment I thought it had spotted me, but then it turned away, resuming its patrol. I allowed myself a shallow breath before continuing. The corridor ahead loomed dark and foreboding, but it was better than remaining exposed. I darted through the opening just as the sentinel began to turn again, vanishing into the shadows of the maze. The walls of the new corridor were closer here, their surfaces covered in pulsating veins that oozed a faintly glowing ichor. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the temperature fluctuated wildly, shifting from blistering heat to bone-chilling cold. Each step felt heavier, as though the maze itself sought to slow my progress. The second challenge was more insidious. As I crept further into the labyrinth, I became aware of faint movements in the periphery of my vision. Flickers of motion, too quick to track, danced along the edges of the corridor. Whispers followed, low and indistinct. but maddeningly persistent. They spoke of failure, of death, of my inevitable corruption. I clenched my teeth, refusing to succumb to the Labyrinth's mind games. Chaos was a master of manipulation, but I had trained to withstand such assaults. Still, the whispers gnawed at the edges of my resolve, their voices growing louder with every step. Ahead, the corridor split into 3 passages, each one identical to the others. The whispers seemed to emanate from all 3, their voices blending into a cacophony that made it impossible to focus. I hesitated, my instincts warring with the confusion that clouded my mind. Then I saw it, a faint marking etched into the wall of the leftmost corridor. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I recognized its jagged lines. A chaos rune, similar to the ones the sorcerer had shown me before. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the only lead I had. I moved cautiously into the leftmost passage, my hand resting on the hilt of my dagger. The whispers subsided slightly, but their presence lingered, a constant reminder of the Labyrinth's malevolence. The next chamber was smaller, its walls lined with grotesque statues that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. At the center of the room stood another sentinel, this one smaller but no less deadly. Its form was more humanoid, with elongated limbs and a head that split into multiple jagged maws. It stood still, but its many eyes roved constantly, searching for any sign of movement. A direct confrontation would be suicide, I said. I surveyed the room, noting the faint glimmer of a rune inscribed on the far wall. It pulsed faintly, its energy tied to the sentinel. A trap, no doubt, designed to spring the moment someone entered the chamber. I reached into my pouch, pulling out a small glass sphere filled with a swirling dark mist, a distraction. With a practiced flick of my wrist, I hurled it toward the opposite end of the room. The sphere shattered against the floor, releasing a plume of shadow that writhed like a living thing. Behind me, the sentinel reacted instantly, its many eyes locking onto the disturbance. It moved with terrifying speed, its limbs propelling it toward the shadow with an unnatural grace. While it was distracted, I darted toward the rune, moving low and fast. My hand brushed against the rune, and I felt a surge of energy as it dissipated beneath my touch. The sentinel froze, its limbs twitching as the magic that bound it faltered. Without wasting a moment, I slipped past it, vanishing into the corridor beyond. The whispers faded as I moved deeper into the labyrinth, but the weight of the maze pressed heavier on my shoulders. Each step brought me closer to my goal, but I knew the worst was yet to come. The labyrinth was alive, and it would not let me escape so easily. Chapter 8. The First Trial. The labyrinth had no mercy. And so too. The corridor ahead narrowed, its walls alive with a faint pulsing glow that matched the rhythm of a heartbeat. The air was stifling, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of molten metal. My instincts screamed a warning even before I stepped forward. Something was wrong. No, everything was wrong, but the only way was forward. I took a careful step, my boots gliding over the uneven surface. Beneath the shadows, the floor appeared solid, but I knew better than to trust my eyes. Chaos thrived on deception. As I moved further into the corridor, the first trap revealed itself. A subtle, almost imperceptible hiss as the floor shifted beneath me. I leapt back just in time. A section of the floor dropped away, revealing a chasm filled with molten metal. The heat radiating from it was blistering, and I could feel my skin begin to sweat even through my cloak. The molten metal churned like a living thing, its surface roiling with unnatural energy. The floor began to reassemble itself, the stones grinding and locking back into place as if nothing had happened. A warning, I realized. The labyrinth was testing me. Its traps designed not merely to kill, but to gauge my resolve, my cunning, and my patience. I crouched low, examining the corridor ahead. The faint outline of runes was etched into the floor, subtle markers indicating the safe path. The problem was that the markings shifted, their positions altering every few seconds. I would need to move quickly and precisely, or I would be another charred corpse among countless others. Taking a deep breath, I committed the first set of positions to memory and leapt forward. My foot landed squarely on the marked stone, and the floor beneath me remained stable. Another leap, then another, each one timed perfectly as the runes flickered and changed. The heat rose with every step, and the air grew heavy with the smell of burning metal. Midway through the corridor, the runes disappeared entirely. I froze, my mind racing. Without the markers, I was flying blind. The walls began to shift now, groaning as they moved inward, their jagged edges scraping against each other. They were closing in, and if I hesitated any longer, I would be crushed. I forced myself forward, trusting my instincts. The floor shifted beneath me again, but I leapt before it could collapse, landing hard on a narrow ledge. The walls were perilously close now, and I could feel their heat against my skin as sparks rained down from above. Another leap carried me to safety, just as the corridor behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash. I allowed myself a brief moment to catch my breath, but the labyrinth had no intention of granting me respite. The next chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in the shadows above. The floor was a mosaic of shifting tiles, each one engraved with a different chaos rune. As I stepped closer, the tiles began to light up in sequences, creating a pathway that zigzagged across the room. Below the tiles, a faint glow revealed pools of molten metal, their surfaces bubbling ominously. The rules here were clear enough. Step on the wrong tile, and I would die. I studied the pattern, my mind working furiously to memorize the sequence before the runes shifted again. Timing and precision were everything now. My muscles tensed as I prepared to move. The first few steps were simple enough. The tiles held firm beneath my boots, their runes glowing faintly as I passed. But the sequence grew more complex with each step, the runes shifting faster, their patterns designed to confuse and mislead. One wrong move, and I would plunge into the molten abyss below. Necessity would undo the magic from Shang-Chi, preventing me from getting where I needed to go. Halfway across the room, the tiles began to move, sliding and rotating with chaotic energy. The labyrinth was no longer content to test my memory. It wanted my reflexes, my resolve, my will to survive. He had finished filling the third glass with taps and crumbled it in the sand. What? I leapt onto a tile just as the one beneath me slid away, catching my balance as the floor shifted again. The heat was oppressive now, searing through my cloak and making it hard to breathe. I moved with the precision of a predator, each step calculated and deliberate, every decision made in a split second. And then the labyrinth cheated. A jet of molten metal erupted from the pool below, searing the air inches from my face. I threw myself forward, landing hard on a safe tile as the eruption subsided. The labyrinth wasn't testing me anymore. It was toying with me, its traps designed not just to kill, but to humiliate and break me. I gritted my teeth, my resolve hardening. Chaos would not win. I was Maltheris, and I had endured worse than this. The final stretch was the most treacherous, The tiles shifted so rapidly that they were little more than blurs of light, their runes a confusing mess of symbols. I moved instinctively now, trusting my body to react faster than my mind. Leaping, rolling, and sprinting, I reached the edge of the chamber just as the final tiles crumbled into the molten abyss behind me. I collapsed against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My body ached, my skin burned, and my heart thundered in my chest, but I was alive. Barely. The labyrinth had thrown its worst at me, and I had survived. But I knew better than to celebrate. This was only the beginning. The true horrors lay ahead, waiting in the shadows. I rose to my feet, gripping my daggers tightly as I pressed onward into the maze. The labyrinth would not break me. Not yet. Chapter 9. Minions of Chaos. The air grew heavier as I ventured deeper into the labyrinth. The oppressive stillness was gone, replaced by faint, distant murmurs and the rhythmic clang of metal on stone. I melted into the shadows, my senses sharpening as I crept forward. The labyrinth was alive with movement now, and I was not alone. Any second, Maddie might notice. The corridor opened into a wide chamber, its floor littered with shattered bones and broken weapons. At the far end, torchlight flickered, casting grotesque shadows that writhed against the jagged walls. A group of figures moved through the room, their voices low and guttural. Chaos acolytes. There were 5 of them, clad in piecemeal armor adorned with crude symbols of the dark gods. Their movements were disciplined, purposeful, as they patrolled the chamber. 2 carried heavy maces, while the others bore axes and jagged swords. The leader, distinguished by a serrated blade and a helmet fashioned into a leering skull, barked orders in a harsh, guttural tongue. I slipped closer, hugging the walls, my every step silent. The acolytes were oblivious to my presence, their attention focused on their patrol. Chaos often bred arrogance, and these fools were no exception. They thought themselves safe within their god's domain, but they hadn't accounted for me. My plan formed quickly. Their formation was tight, their movements predictable. I needed to strike fast, sow confusion, and eliminate them before they could sound an alarm. I reached for my pouch, pulling free a small glass sphere filled with a noxious black vapor. My fingers brushed the hilt of my daggers, readying for what would come next. The leader turned his back to me. Perfect. I hurled the sphere into their midst, and it shattered against the ground with a faint pop. A cloud of shadowy mist erupted, engulfing the acolytes in an impenetrable haze. Coughs and shouts of alarm echoed through the chamber as they scrambled to regroup. I struck before they could. The first acolyte didn't see me coming. My dagger plunged into his throat, cutting off his scream as I dragged him into the shadows. The second stumbled toward the sound, his mace raised, but my blade was faster. A quick slash opened his neck, and he collapsed in a gurgling heap. The remaining 3 were on edge now, their weapons raised, their eyes darting wildly through the mist. The leader shouted commands, trying to restore order, but it was too late. Chaos thrived on disorder, and I was its master now. I darted between them, my movements a blur. My daggers flashed, carving through armor and flesh with practiced precision. One acolyte fell, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock. Another swung wildly with his axe, but I ducked beneath the blow and drove my blade into his side. He collapsed with a strangled cry. Only the leader remained. The mist began to dissipate, and he turned to face me, his serrated blade gleaming in the torchlight. His eyes burned with fury, but there was a flicker of something else. Fear. He lunged, his blade arcing toward my throat, but I sidestepped effortlessly. His swing left him open, and I seized the opportunity, driving my dagger into the gap beneath his arm. The smooth power of the dagger's slide to free my dagger. He roared in pain, dropping his weapon as he staggered back. I moved in for the kill, but he collapsed to his knees, clutching at his wound. His voice was low and rasping as he muttered a prayer to his dark god. I crouched before him, tilting my head as I studied him. "You have something I want," I said, my voice a venomous whisper. "Speak, and I may grant you a swift death." He coughed, blood trickling from his lips, but he managed to grin. "You will not escape. The Guardian watches." "The Guardian," I pressed, gripping his chin and forcing him to meet my gaze. "Tell me what you mean." "The Minotaur," he rasped, his eyes glazing over. "The master of the Labyrinth. It waits for you." My grip tightened. "Where is it? Where is the artifact?" His laugh was wet and broken. "You'll see. Soon enough. It's already too late. For you." I slit his throat before he could utter another word. His body crumpled to the floor, his lifeblood pooling beneath him. I stood, wiping my blade clean as I surveyed the carnage. The chamber was silent once more, but his words echoed in my mind. The Minotaur, the master of the Labyrinth. I had heard whispers of such creatures before, beasts of chaos, touched by the dark gods and bound to their will. If one guarded the artifact, then the path ahead would be far more treacherous than I had anticipated. But I had come too far to turn back. The Labyrinth had thrown its minions at me, and I had bested them. It would throw its champion next, but I would be ready. I was Maltheris, and I would not be stopped. With one last glance at the bodies of the acolytes, I disappeared into the shadows, pressing deeper into the maze. Chapter 10. Labyrinth's Curse. The Labyrinth was alive, and it hated me. 1. The walls shifted as I moved, twisting and writhing like serpents shedding their skin. Passages that had been straight seconds before curved impossibly, looping back on themselves or vanishing entirely. The air was heavy with the stink of sulfur and decay, and the low, maddening hum of chaos sorcery reverberated through the stone. Finally, my head throbbed with each step, as if the labyrinth itself were clawing at my mind. Whispers filled my ears, faint and indistinct at first, but growing louder the deeper I ventured. They spoke in no language I could understand, yet their intent was unmistakable. Malice, doubt, despair. "Turn back," they hissed. "You are nothing. You will fail." I clenched my jaw, forcing the voices into the back of my mind. Chaos thrived on fear, on the weakness of the spirit. I would give it no such satisfaction. But its grip tightened with every passing moment, and I could feel the weight of the labyrinth pressing down on me like a shroud. The corridors began to play tricks on my vision. Patterns in the stone shifted when I wasn't looking, forming shapes and runes that pulsed faintly with dark energy. Shadows writhed and danced at the edges of my sight, just out of reach. I spun once, blades drawn, certain I had seen a figure dart behind me, only to find nothing but empty air. This was no mere maze of stone and mortar. This was a living thing, a creature born of chaos, and I was an intruder in its body. Time lost meaning here. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps the reverse. My steps grew heavier, the weight of the labyrinth's sorcery seeping into my bones. I paused in a narrow corridor, leaning against the wall as my breath came in ragged gasps. The whispers clawed at my resolve, mocking and taunting. "You are lost. You will never escape. This is where you die." Footnote. "No," I hissed through gritted teeth, my voice barely audible. "This is where I win." I forced myself to move, my hand brushing against the hilt of my dagger as a reminder of who I was. Maltheris, assassin of Naggarond, a predator, not prey. The labyrinth might bend reality, but I would bend it back with will and cunning. The next passage opened into a circular chamber, its walls adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe as I approached. At the center of the room stood a pedestal upon which rested a small glowing orb. Its light was faint but steady, a rare beacon of stability in this ever-changing nightmare. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning the room for traps. The labyrinth would not make this easy. The carvings on the walls seemed to writhe more violently as I drew closer, and the whispers grew louder, their tone desperate. "Do not touch it. You are unworthy. You will die. Don't even look at it." Ignoring the voices, I reached for the orb. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, the room erupted into chaos. The walls shifted violently, the carvings transforming into grotesque faces that screamed in unison. The floor beneath me buckled and twisted, sending me sprawling. The orb flared with blinding light, then shattered, its fragments dissolving into the air. I scrambled to my feet, my daggers drawn as the walls closed in around me. The labyrinth roared with fury, its voice a deafening cacophony that threatened to tear me apart. But even in the chaos, I noticed something. The fragments of the orb had left a faint trail of light, a path leading out of the chamber. It was a trap, surely, but it was also the only way forward. I moved quickly, following the light as the walls continued to writhe and shift around me. The corridor twisted and turned, its path impossibly convoluted, but the light never faltered. It was as if the labyrinth itself was leading me, though whether to salvation or doom I could not say. Stepping. At last, the passage opened into another chamber, its walls lined with jagged mirrors that reflected distorted versions of myself. The reflections moved independently, their eyes glowing with malevolent light. One of them sneered, its voice cutting through the whispers. "You are nothing but a pawn, Maltheris. A dog chasing scraps." "Oh," I snarled, throwing a dagger at the mirror. The blade shattered the glass and the reflection disappeared, but the others only laughed, their voices blending into a mocking chorus. I forced myself to ignore them, focusing instead on the far side of the chamber. A single door stood there, its surface etched with runes that pulsed faintly. The whispers reached a fever pitch as I approached, and the reflections screamed, their faces contorted with rage. With a growl, I shoved the door open and stepped through, slamming it shut behind me. The whispers stopped instantly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint thrum of chaos energy in the air. The corridor ahead was silent and still, but I could feel the labyrinth's malice lingering, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. It would not stop until I was broken. But I was not broken yet. I straightened, wiping the sweat from my brow as I pressed on. The labyrinth had shown me its curse, its ability to warp the mind and soul. But I would not fall to it. I had come too far, and the artifact was within my grasp. Let the labyrinth twist and writhe. Let it scream and rage. I would conquer it. Or I would die trying. Either way, I would leave my mark.